Look, many of the things that you brought up are real. We see this been happening for decades, where it's problematic more so than ever with these issues in Palestine and the Arabic world, is the fact that there's very little Arab voices that are allowed to be speaking. And most of those who are speaking are white, sometimes mostly also Jewish white. And so here is people from the oppressor group being not only dominating the right wing and the imperialist media platforms, but are also dominating the little space that is there to be progressive, to be anti-imperialist on these, supposed independent media outlets. It really bothers me when people talk about prisons and in Syria, or say police state in Syria, and especially when they're sitting in the United States or they're American citizens, where the United States has the largest prison population in the world and the highest per capita incarceration rate. That's, we're talking close to 4 million people in the United States are in jail, and the incarceration rate is like close to 700 people per 100,000. And this is the highest incarceration rate and biggest prison population in the history of humanity. 25% of people in jails on this planet are in the United States, which is 5% of the population of the world. Yeah. And so you look at the history of just the last 30, 40 years in the United States, and you can see that every African diaspora, every indigenous, every Latino leaders of liberation in the United States were killed, assassinated in public, were jailed, were exiled, some of them still rotting in the jails right now, the Black Panthers and others, hundreds of them rotting in the jails of the United States. And torture. How can you, after Guantanamo Bay, after Abu Ghraib, after the black sites of disappearance sites that the United States ran over the last decade, how can you even accuse anybody of anything like that? And here, when we're talking about Syria, prior to the 2011 war on Syria, there was only 10,599 prisoners in Syria, and all the prisons of Syria. So one is 4 million, the other is 10,000. The prison population rate was 60 to 100,000, as opposed to almost 700 in the United States, to 100,000. When you say a police state, and the New York Police Department alone is considered the 4th biggest army in the world, militarily. It's unbelievable to, it reminds me when people say these things about Syria or Cuba, for instance, say, oh, police state, dictatorship, or so forth. It reminds me of the Zionists claiming everything is anti-Semitic. It loses the meaning of the word. If you have such a flagrant police state dictatorship as the United States, that is with such high numbers, and you want to compare Syria to it and then call Syria a police state, it means this word doesn't have a meaning. And so most people that are speaking in such ways, and we call them left or progressive, they're doing it to maintain some credibility in front of this imaginary Western audience that they're pitching their stories to. And this is where it's very dangerous, because it means that those individuals are not prioritizing truth. They're prioritizing their careers. I can't believe somebody would, on the one hand, some of these reporters that we saw talk about the oligarchy and the lack of democracy in the United States. And we saw what happened to Corbyn or Sanders, and there's a lot of criticism to those two individuals. But we saw how democracy doesn't really exist in the United States. And then turn around and call Syria a dictatorship, a country that has been under CIA war since 1942, since before the CIA was created.
Yeah, exactly. Or to call out undemocratic elections in Syria when, you know, American elections are really nothing more than pure theater, right? Or talk about, of course, when we talk about torture, let's also remember that the US has trained the UAE camp, what do you call them, guards in the south of Yemen that are torturing Yemenis, you know? I mean, both Israel and the US have exported torture and police brutality globally, you know, and yet you have pundits from that country calling out Syria. And it's also worth pointing out for people that prior to 2011, Amnesty International, Anwar Bunni, who was an opposition legal figure, a very prominent figure, both Amnesty International and Bunni stated that there were only around 1,500 political prisoners in Syrian jails, and Assad released 800 of those. And when we talk about political prisoners, of course, this terminology is also misleading, because political prisoners refers mostly to prisoners that were taken in the late 70s and 80s during the CIA engineered Muslim Brotherhood uprising, which was put down by Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad. But of course, what is never mentioned is that these political prisoners carried out attacks on civilian targets, carried out sectarian massacres, exactly as they have done from 2011 onwards. So the lexicon is also very misleading. And the fact that this lexicon is being parroted by journalists who are not doing the background reading to either justify their conclusions, which I believe they would struggle to do if they did actually do some research, or to balance out and contextualize their conclusions, right? And this is what worries me, is that we're going to be left with these kind of shallow talking points that basically reinforce Western media manufacturing consent for another interventionist war, whether it is Syria, whether it is the next target nation, whether it's China, of course, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia. The list is still quite long. And I think if there's one message that I would like to put out to people, you are going to start losing the voices that are going to counterbalance these narratives. So it is very important not to take these utterances at face value. And I think, you know, Laith, you've really made it very clear that where these, the danger is that these talking points are coming from what should be safe ground for most people, right? But I think the warning is, don't trust anyone. Do your own research, do your own digging, make your own conclusions, right? I think that's the only thing we can now say, because my voice, your voice is quite possibly going to disappear at some point altogether, right?
Yeah. Look, if you, all these accusations that are being thrown at Syria by individuals who are supposedly criticizing imperialism, it's laughable, because at the same time you look at, they themselves admit that there is no democracy in the United States or the West, that there is genocides being committed by the imperialist forces, that even if you want to claim that war crimes are being committed by this or that small state, it is nothing in comparison to the war crimes of the United States. There is no freedom of speech in the United States. There is a police state that is wild, killing every day on average two African Americans. Their police forces on average in all major cities is two African Americans shot dead by the police a day. And they are sitting in this inside the belly of the beast, inside the empire. They cannot achieve change in their states. That is the apex of the imperial order. They cannot achieve even electing somebody as bland as Sanders, or bring themselves health care, and they demand from nations that are attempting to decolonize, that have been in a war of decolonization since the end of World War II, who hasn't had one day of rest. They demand that those states like Syria or Cuba or North Korea to have the utopic achieved. Otherwise, they will not stand by them. And you're like, but you have all the freedoms, supposedly, and the comfort to achieve those supposed utopic rights of democracy and equality and so forth, and you can't achieve them. But you want us under a war since 1942, eight different coups before the Ba'ath came into power in the 1970s. 8 different coups that were caused by the CIA in Syria alone. And so it doesn't make sense. None of the things that they're saying make sense. And it just requires very simple thought, ideas that I just put forward to you to clearly show that it doesn't make sense what they're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Laith, thank you so much. Where can